I'm Stepan Wood. Thank you for joining us for the second in a series of seminars that confront the challenge of combating racism in contemporary law, organized by the Anti-Racism and the Law Initiative, ARLI, at UBC's Allard School of Law. This seminar series focuses on systemic barriers that are of particular relevance to the law school and the university. One of these systemic injustices concerns the distribution of environmental benefits and harms in contemporary settler colonial societies. The title of today's seminar is Bearing a Disproportionate Burden: Law, Race, Colonialism, and Environmental Injustice. We will hear presentations from two leading experts on environmental racism in Canada and an expert on water politics in occupied Palestinian territories and Golan. ARLI is an initiative of a diverse coalition of Allard faculty members seeking to work together across difference on issues that the law school must engage with as a community of thoughtful scholars and educators. We believe that humanity is at a critical juncture in collective struggles for social justice. The Black Lives Matter movement brought police violence and a racially unjust criminal justice system to the forefront of public consciousness. Resistance to energy infrastructure development and old growth logging in British Columbia are highlighting the role of law in defending extractive industries against Indigenous land defenders, while the unequal impacts of COVID-19 and climate change-induced wildfires, floods, and landslides on racialized and Indigenous communities highlight entrenched forms of inequality. The law school is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam Nation, which has endured environmental injustices at the hands of the settler colonial state, ranging from forced removal from all but a postage stamp-sized fraction of its territory and natural resource base, to denial of its inherent salmon fishing rights and destruction of its oyster beds to protect shipping in the Fraser River. The university and the law school, uninvited guests on Musqueam territory, have only recently begun to acknowledge and confront their complicity in these injustices. Today's seminar will be recorded and publicly available on YouTube on the channel of the Center for Business Law. You can find it by searching Center for Business Law, spelled R-E in the British and Canadian spelling, on YouTube. We're going to hear from each of our speakers for 15 to 20 minutes, followed by questions and discussions. Please use the Q&A tool in your Zoom controls to pose and upvote questions. I will moderate the Q&A, and I will introduce each speaker briefly before she speaks, starting with Dr. Ingrid Waldron. You can see fuller biographies on the event webpage. Our first speaker, Dr. Ingrid Waldron, is the Hope Chair in Peace and Health in the Global Peace and Global Justice Program at McMaster University. She's the founder and director of the Environmental Noxiousness, Racial Inequities, and Community Health, or ENRICH project, which inspired the federal private members bill C-230, a national strategy respecting environmental racism and environmental justice. She's the author of the book, There's Something in the Water, and the producer of the eponymous Netflix documentary. She is co-founder of the Canadian Coalition for Environmental and Climate Justice, and her work focuses on environmental racism, climate justice, mental health, and the structural and environmental determinants of health disparities in Black, Indigenous, immigrant, and refugee communities. Please welcome Dr. Ingrid Waldron.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction, and I'd like to thank everyone for attending this evening. I'm just pulling up my slides. I'm hoping that that you can see it right now. Can you see it? Okay. So I want to begin with a quote from Vanessa Gray, who's an environmental activist in Umjinwang First Nation. And Vanessa says, the land is our mother. So when we lose value for the land, people lose value for the women. And indeed, Indigenous and Black women and other racialized women have been building grassroots environmental and social justice movements for decades to challenge the legal, political, and corporate agendas that sanction and enable environmental racism and other forms of colonial violence in their communities. Colonial gendered violence continues today and includes the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women, the displacement of Indigenous peoples from their lands by corporate resource extraction projects, anti-Black and anti-Indigenous police violence, and other forms of state-sanctioned violence. Colonization and genocide are tied to the intersections of Indigenous lands and bodies. Women experience violence because they are the ones that are responsible for taking care of the land and holding it for future generations. Therefore, gendered violence that harms women specifically also harms nations, making it much easier to take possession of the land. For Indigenous women specifically, production and reproduction, land and life, and resistance and survival are all intimately connected. There's no separation. Therefore, the Indigenous role in fighting against environmental racism by defending their land and territory and protecting their water are acts of resistance against gendered oppression. So what is environmental racism? It was a question that was posed to me often when I started the Enrich project back in 2012. Here on the screen is James Desmond. When I started the project, I actually visited his community of Lincolnville. It's an African Nova Scotian community, and I wanted to get from him his definition of environmental racism, and this is what he says. He says, environmental racism is the practice of locating industrial waste sites next to African Nova Scotian Native and poor white communities, communities that don't have a base to fight back. You ask if that's environmental racism, it's environmental racism to its core. But I also wanted to provide you with the more academic definition of environmental racism that comes from Dr. Robert Bullard, who many consider to be the father of environmental justice. He teaches at a university in Texas. And Dr. Bullard says, environmental racism is racism in the racism in the disproportionate location and greater exposure of Indigenous and other racialized communities to contamination and pollution from polluting industries and other environmentally hazardous activities. Environmental racism is racism in the lack of political power these communities have for resisting the placement of industrial polluters in their communities. Environmental racism is racism in the implementation of policies that sanction the harmful and in many cases life-threatening presence of poisons in their communities. Environmental racism is racism in the disproportionate negative impacts of environmental policies that result in differential rates of cleanup of environmental contaminants in these communities. And finally, environmental racism is discrimination in the history of excluding Indigenous and racialized communities from mainstream environmental groups, decision-making boards and bodies, commissions, and regulatory organizations. In Canada, over the past 70 years, there have been several cases of environmental racism. And I want to begin first with Nova Scotia, where I lived for 13 years. I recently left Halifax. I'm teaching now at McMaster, but this is where my work began. And I want to begin with the community of Sipekne'katik First Nation. There you see in the photo Doreen Bernard, who is one of the leaders or one of the environmental activists in Sipekne'katik First Nation. And she's part of a group that refer to themselves as the grassroots grandmothers. And over the last, up until recently, 7 years, Sipekne'katik First Nation has been opposing the development by Alton Gas of a brine discharge pipeline near the Shubenacadie River in Nova Scotia. Great news, about a month ago, the project was canceled. So this is a community who has been engaged in numerous activities in person, on site, also online to halt this project. And finally, we learned about a month ago that this project was finally canceled. I would say over the past 2 years, a lot of success in Nova Scotia in terms of addressing environmental racism. There's also Pictou Landing First Nation, which I consider to be one of the worst cases of environmental racism, along with Amjinwang First Nation. Between 1967 and January 31st, 2020, Northern Pulp Mill had been dumping effluent into Boat Harbor, which is in Pictou Landing First Nation. Yes, we heard at the end of 2019, around Christmas time, that the government of Nova Scotia was planning to close the mill. And that did happen at the end of January. So the community is now going through a cleanup. Amjinwang First Nation, once again, one of the worst cases to me of environmental racism in Canada. It's often referred to as Chemical Valley. It's a community in Sarnia, Ontario, and they are surrounded by over 60 petrochemical facilities within a 25 square kilometer area. We have Grassy Narrows First Nation. Grassy Narrows First Nation near Kenora, Ontario, has been concerned about mercury contamination of the Wabigoon English River near their community. There was cleanup several years ago, I think it was 5 years ago, but the community still has concerns, of course, about the impact of mercury contamination on health, on community members. I think the case of Wet'suwet'en First Nation has probably gotten the most attention over the past 4 or 5 years, particularly from the media. So over the past few years, mass demonstrations and sit-ins and blockades have gripped parts of Canada over the movement to support the leaders of Wet'suwet'en First Nation, who are opposed to a multi-billion-dollar pipeline project in northern BC. There are also Black communities that are impacted by environmental racism. So far, it seems to be predominantly in Nova Scotia. There perhaps are other, I've returned to Ontario, so I'm going to be investigating whether or not Black communities are near, and they are, Scarborough, Ontario. I've heard about Black communities being near industrial complexes. So it's something that I need to investigate. I've just returned to Ontario, so I need to do that work. But what I found is there are several cases of environmental racism in Nova Scotia, and I've often asked myself why, and I think it has to do with the combination of race, low socioeconomic status, but also African Nova Scotians, more so than other Black communities in Canada, tend to live in isolated communities. They are referred to as historical Black communities, and they're very isolated. I would say it's rural to some extent, and many of them don't have access to hospitals, paved roads, grocery stores. So I think the combination of race and socioeconomic status and education and living in an out of the way area allows or enables environmental racism in many ways. I see Africville, that you see on the screen here, as an example of both gentrification, urban renewal, and environmental racism. This is a historic Black community that was pushed out of their community in the late 1960s because the city of Halifax was making way for industrial development. So the environmental hazards included a fertilizer plant, a slaughterhouse, a tar factory, a stone and coal crushing plant, a cotton factory, a prison, 3 systems of railway tracks, and an open dump. You also have Lincolnville. You just saw a photo of James Desmond. This is his community. So Lincolnville has had a first and second generation landfill since 1974 and 2006. Shelburne. South Shelburne is primarily a Black community in Nova Scotia. North Shelburne is primarily white. Shelburne has had a dump in their community since 1943. They were able to get that dump closed in December of 2016. So similar to what I mentioned with Grassy Narrows, while cleanup can happen and a dump can be closed, the community still has to contend with the health fallout of toxic industries. So Shelburne has extremely high rates of cancer. And the leader there would say that 98% of the people in the community has cancer, including multiple myeloma, which is a blood cancer and a rare cancer. So while cleanup can happen, we also have to remember that the health effects remain. I talked a little bit about health, and I wanted to provide you with the term that's often used to refer to health disparities between and among populations as a result to their proximity to toxic burdens. In Canada, over the past 20 years, I would say that there have been several studies that show the racial dimensions of health, environmental health inequities, and show that the spatial patterning of industry, primarily in Indigenous and other racialized communities, is connected to high rates of various illnesses and diseases. And they include things like cancer and respiratory illnesses, cardiovascular disease, reproductive illnesses, including reproductive cancers, which is something I want to talk about now because I think it's important to gender health, to gender this issue. And when we gender this issue, we realize that there's a specific form of colonial, racialized, and gendered violence that's happening with environmental racism and its health impacts in the way that it impacts the bodies, well-being, and health of Indigenous and Black women. And one of the most insidious ways in which environmental racism impacts Indigenous and Black women is through the detrimental health effects of toxic contaminants on their reproductive health, as I mentioned earlier, including high levels of toxins in breast milk and placenta, cord blood, as well as infertility, miscarriages, premature births, premature menopause, reproductive system cancers, and an inability to produce healthy children due to compromised endocrine and immune systems while in utero. So these are all issues that I've been trying to deal with, the social, economic, political, and health effects of environmental racism through the Enrich Project, the Environmental Noxiousness, Racial Inequities, and Community Health Project, which I began in the spring of 2012 when an environmental activist came to me and asked me to take on a project on environmental racism. At that time, that was 9 years ago, I had no idea what that was. I'd never heard of environmental racism in my life, and I was consequently very hesitant to take on the project because I thought, well, I don't have an environmental science degree, so why am I doing this? And somebody's going to call me out, because I don't know anything about pollutants and contaminants. But I soon realized that as a health researcher and as someone who has a PhD in sociology, that I can bring a different perspective to this. I wanted to talk about colonialism, capitalism, racism, gender, all the things that sociologists talk about. So I realized that although I have no background in contaminants and pollutants, that I can come at this in a different way. I wanted to make sure that the project was community-based and led by community. I also designed the Enrich Project to be, of course, collaborative, multi-method, interdisciplinary, multi-sectoral, and multimedia. And so far, over the past 9 years, it's engaged in a number of activities that reflect those things. One of the things I continue to do is to raise awareness through public engagement events like symposiums and workshops and the typical academic conferences, etc. Because I know that in order to get people to act, they have to have empathy. In order for them to have empathy, they have to have information. And I've seen it, and we all see it, when I speak to somebody who has emailed me, they want to talk about this, and they say, I'm from Nova Scotia, I had no idea this was going on. It's right in my backyard. I've learned about it in many ways, and now I want to help. Tell me what I can do. They were lacking information before. Now that they have information, they feel a sense of empathy and they want to act. So I know that raising awareness is something that for this particular issue, for environmental racism, needs to be done. And I'm seeing the media pick up on it now as well. Certainly that was happening a long time ago in Nova Scotia, but more broadly in Canada, people are naming it for what it is. As a professor, of course, I have to publish, but more importantly than that is that policymakers respond to data, primarily perhaps quantitative data, but also qualitative data. And this book tracks the journey that I've taken to direct the Enrich Project over the years. This book came out in 2018, published by Fernwood. And what I wanted to do is to, trace my journey, but also talk about the mistakes I made. I think people typically think, oh, it's community-based, that's easy. Community-based is not easy. It's harder than anything else because you may want things to go a certain way as a professor, and you've got to put this into ethics, but the community might say, no, I'm not on your timeline, Ingrid, you're on our timeline. So, I have a chapter talking about community-based research and the challenges that I've experienced doing it because I wasn't trained on this. And I talk about the mistakes that I made. particularly around Pictou Landing First Nation. I was gung-ho. I want to go to Pictou Landing First Nation and I want to meet the community. And the chief kind of was like, wait a second, we're not ready for you right now. There are tons of Dalhousie professors coming up, and you're another Dalhousie professor, and I'm not sure I want you right now, right? So you've got to swallow your pride when you do this, and you have to realize that you have to kind of take the temperature of the community, and they may not be ready for you. So community-based research is extremely difficult, but I wanted to talk about the mistakes I made in terms of community engagement. I also talk about the health effects, and this book is really about the voices of community. I center them in the book. I talk about their grassroots mobilizing over the years, the challenges, the successes that they've had. And I also talk about what needs to be done, particularly around environmental assessments and having health equity lens and a structural determinants of health lens. In 2016, because there were quite a few kind of naysayers, you know, people emailing me and saying, is this really real? I've never heard of environmental racism, and isn't it about class, Ingrid? You know, you're making it about race. And I thought, well, if we can kind of show this on a map, maybe it would convince people. So I had my research assistant develop this map that shows 2 layers on the website, one for Mi'kmaq communities and another for African Nova Scotian communities. And it actually, as you can see, it shows the Mi'kmaq community is the red dots and the African Nova Scotian community is the blue dots here. So it actually shows the location and the proximity of these communities to pulp and paper mills, incinerators, and dumps. And what my research assistant also did was he also did a kind of an annotated bibliography using the EPA and other websites to also link health and disease. So it's like a health risk assessment annotated bibliography. So for example, if there's a landfill, what would be the materials in a landfill? And then how would that connect to certain illnesses? And this has been kind of powerful, you know, professors have told me they're using it in their class. So it's an educational tool, but I also see it as a policy tool. I see it as something that could be in my toolkit if I decide to go and visit a policymaker or somebody in, you know, Nova Scotia Environment or the Department of Environment. It's another tool in the toolkit, in the toolbox that I can use in addition to literature, in addition to data collection. So I see it as a policy tool. And I should also mention that with the coalition that I co-founded last year, we are using this map to build a Canada-wide map that will track climate change impacts and environmental racism. So we're broadening this map beyond Nova Scotia. One of the communities I work with, I already mentioned them actually, is Lincolnville. And Lincolnville has had that first and second generation landfill, and they've long wanted somebody to test their water, but they certainly didn't want government to do it because they didn't trust government. They felt that government would say everything is fine. So we thought, as you know, researchers, and there was a hydrogeologist on the team, why don't we do it? They're probably going to trust us more than they trust government. So they did. And they asked us to test their water. This was 2016 in the fall. And we were able to write a report and share the findings, go back to the community, and do a workshop on how they should be managing their water, their drinking water resources. And after the project was completed, we were all like, this really worked. And in 2017, we said, this project really worked. Why don't we use a project as a blueprint or a framework to co-found an NGO? And in the spring of 2017, we co-founded Rural Water Watch. Rural Water Watch implements water testing projects in rural Nova Scotian communities, not just Indigenous or Black, but any community that's rural, because in Nova Scotia, at least, maybe other parts of Canada, many rural communities are on well water, and well water tends to be more contaminated. So what we do is we test water, but we also train students, you know, so on our team are typically environmental science students, and we train them to lead some of these projects, and we do workshops as well. I've been consulting with EcoJustice. Also, I started doing that 2016 with respect to Lincolnville through their Calgary office, but in 2018, they opened up an office in Halifax, and I've consulted with them about the communities that I've been working with. And their job is actually just to identify legal remedies to address environmental racism. So that work is ongoing. I've ventured recently into climate change, and I've hooked up with Climate Action Services in order to do workshops in 3 Black communities earlier this year. I'm hoping to use those workshops to perhaps develop a larger study on climate change impacts in Black communities. Is it time for me to end?
We're at 20 minutes, Ingrid. I wonder if you can wrap up soon.
Yes. So I would just say at the end of, just right at the end, legislation is important as well. So we are looking to get Bill C-230 reintroduced. This is a national strategy to redress environmental racism that was introduced last year, and that was kicked, wiped off the table when the election was called in September of this year. So this is actually really important to me. I think legislation is really important, and we're looking for the new environment minister and Justin Trudeau to revive this bill. So that would collect information and disaggregated based data on race, socioeconomic status, and toxic burdens. So there you have it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Ingrid. And sorry to rush you at the end there. That private members bill really is an important landmark and something that we should keep our eyes on, and perhaps we'll circle back to in the Q&A. At this point, though, I'll introduce our second speaker, Dr. Deborah McGregor, my old colleague when I was at Osgoode Hall Law School. Deborah is Associate Professor and Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Environmental Justice at Osgoode Hall Law School and the Faculty of Environmental Studies and Urban Change at York University. She leads a couple of research initiatives on Indigenous environmental injustice and indigenizing First Nations land management regime, as well as being involved in numerous other research projects on such topics as Indigenous knowledge transfer in urban Aboriginal communities and exploring distinctive Indigenous knowledges and their application in coastal fisheries management. She has co-edited a couple of important books, one recently on Indigenous research, theories, practices, and relationships, and another earlier on Indigenous peoples and autonomy. Deborah is Anishinaabeg from Whitefish River First Nation, and her research focuses on Indigenous knowledge systems and their applications in water and environmental governance, environmental justice, forest policy and management, and sustainable development. Thank you very much for joining us, Deborah.
Thank you for having me. It's wonderful to be here, and great to see and hear from Dr. Waldron again. She does amazing work, and hopefully we do hear more about the bill. So what I wanted to talk a little bit about today, I'm going to share a screen so that all of us have been on Zoom so much, like, really, do we need another tiny little head on a screen to look at? So we'll, let me see if I can pull it up, and then we'll make sure that everyone can see it. Yeah, so hopefully you're able to see it. I can see it. This has happened where I can see it and nobody else on the planet can. So the approach I wanted to take in relation to this presentation is more how I tried to think about what Indigenous environmental justice was when I took up a Canada Research Chair in this, because I wasn't really sure. It wasn't really exactly what I was doing for basically my whole career before that, but certainly once I kind of became familiar with the environmental justice theory, and I think Dr. Waldron did a great job of outlining kind of what that is and where it came from and how it could be applied in the Canadian context, which is absolutely important. I was trying to figure out, what does it mean? Like, what would it look like if the origin was based on Indigenous worldview, Indigenous values, laws, and knowledge systems? And but I did want to, as I outline this, this has to do with the view that Indigenous peoples basically leading our own solutions and self-determining our own future. But that doesn't leave governments and others off the hook. And I think that's a lot of the work that Dr. Waldron is doing with this bill that she's proposed and been working really hard on for quite some time. So I did want to acknowledge that, like, absolutely, like, people need to be held accountable. But I'm going to talk about in this presentation about how I see what Indigenous environmental justice looks like. And actually I'm applying it in climate justice as well, Indigenous climate justice. And actually two of my more recent projects deal with that. Like, what does that look like when it's based on knowledge laws and governance? And what does Indigenous climate leadership look like? Because that's sort of like the rhetoric that's coming from the federal government right now, but it doesn't look like there's a lot of support in terms of, you know, Indigenous people actually taking that up. So hopefully I'll get to some of this in the 20 minutes that I have, and I will have to be managed because once this shows up on my screen, I can't see the time anymore. So I'll start. So we've always been here. So this is my starting point for just about anything that I'm doing, is the simple, what to me simple, but it's actually not obvious. I find myself in all these different circles, and this is not obvious, that Indigenous peoples have always been here on these lands and territories and waters that we call Canada at the moment. Indigenous peoples were here, and it was our knowledge systems and our laws and our governance systems and our relationships, how we interacted with each other. That's most of the history here. Colonization is devastating, but more recent. So that needs to be acknowledged. So we had our own laws, we had our own governance systems, we had our own ways of thinking about the world and what our relationships are going to be like with, sometimes I refer to as all of creation, because it includes ancestors, future generations, spirit world. So our concept is very broad in terms of who we're relating to in this. So this is important. So we're not just an add-on to anything Canada or anybody else is doing. It's actually central to the work that I do, and think it should be as we grapple with huge issues in Canada, around the world, in relation to the basically future of humanity. The planet will probably end up doing well, but humans seem to be not super keen on surviving, it looks like. So I wanted to acknowledge, so one of the things that I'm doing in my work to try to ground how I'm approaching answering these questions, like what is Indigenous environmental justice? How is that different than environmental justice? And then add Indigenous on, which tends to happen a lot of the times. And that's still really important. But what's the foundation like when it's Indigenous? I go back to our own stories. And the reason I have this particular image is one of my favorite stories at the moment is the Anishinaabeg Pipe and the Eagle story. And because essentially I look at this as being a climate change story. So a lot of what we're experiencing is already in our history and in our knowledge. It's just, do we know how to read that? Do we know how to draw on that so we don't make a lot of the same mistakes? So what this means is Anishinaabe people were not perfect, but the difference was we had our own ways of dealing with the challenges that we faced. We had our own systems in place to deal with it. It wasn't left up to somebody else to figure out what the solution was and then include us in it. Maybe it was up to us to decide what that was and self-determine what that was going to look like. So we did face a lot of challenges, and a lot of these are in our stories, and I've been paying a lot of attention to these stories and trying to draw out understanding and knowledge from them about how they can be applied into the challenges that we're facing now. Living well and responsibilities. The reason why I wanted to include this is because what's the role of Indigenous peoples in environmental justice or climate justice, whatever it might be? I think Dr. Waldron did a great job of pointing out what the injustices are, how they're systemic and structural, and they're, you just can't snap your fingers and get rid of them. As much as I fantasize about that, it's probably not gonna happen that way. But what we know in terms of the planet, and actually in Canada, is that where Indigenous people live and caretake, probably more caretake is the word, is about 20% of the land mass, the planet, not including water. But that's where 80% of the biodiversity is. So Indigenous people's knowledge, governance, and laws is contributing to this. And in those spaces, that's where Indigenous languages are spoken. So it's like, what is it about our knowledge and our language and the way that we live that enables intact ecosystems and great biodiversity? And this is true in Canada as well. Often the places of the greatest where you can find species at risk because everybody else has killed them is in First Nations, even more so than protected areas. what I'm telling you now about Indigenous people and biodiversity is actually higher than actually in protected areas or parks or whatever you want to call them. So to me, there's something about how we understand our relationship to the world and our responsibilities. And that's what I wanted to focus a lot of my scholarship on. What does that look like? I mean, I have a personal interest as an Anishinaabe person as well, you know, having had knowledge and language disrupted through colonial processes in my own family. So this is of importance to me in that respect as well. And a lot of the injustices that Dr. Waldron talked about is something that I live every day. Right now I'm in Toronto, but if I went home, can't drink the water like I used to be able to do when I was growing up. So this is something that's the everyday reality of my family and community. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but things aren't looking good. I call it the disaster reports. This is the IPCC report, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report that came in on August of 2021, code red. This is the decade where we really need to make a difference. And the reason I mentioned this is because it essentially whatever system that we're dealing with right now, beyond Canada, the global economic, political, whatever system, it's not working, it's failing. So we need to look at transformation and other ways of looking at the world. And I believe that Indigenous peoples have something to offer in that regard, even though these reports don't really deal with Indigenous knowledge or Indigenous peoples all that well. They in some bizarre ways they're trying to, they just really don't know how. So it's not looking good because the current system is failing miserably. And it doesn't really, they often don't really, they might recognize disproportionate impacts, but they don't want to talk about what Dr. Ingrid talked about. They want to talk about colonialism. You have a hard time finding, I don't even remember if you can find colonialism in there. And also racism, like people don't like to talk about those kind of words in these circles that I often find myself in. So, but we have to acknowledge colonialism. It doesn't matter what the topic is. In the climate change circles that I'm in, it's sort of like, people don't want to go there. I'm happy to talk about the C word, carbon word, but not the colonialism C word, I find, or capitalism, you know. So, but you need to acknowledge this because it affects everybody, and it's actually part of Canada's institutions. This is what the Truth and Reconciliation report pointed out. It was what the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples report put out. Just about every single justice report in relation to Indigenous peoples has pointed this out. The picture, this one is the residential school that my mother went to. And so cultural genocide is like a reality for Indigenous people. And that was very race-based. That was targeted towards Indigenous peoples as part of this residential school system. Now, it's not, should be news to you, front page news, May and June about, you know, the children's bodies that, you know, residential school survivors knew about around the schools. I don't like to say discovered because they knew all along and people didn't listen. And so this is a reality in Canada, and it hasn't gone away just because, you know, residential schools have been shut down. So what are some Indigenous environmental justice concepts? Like, how do I think about this when I'm drawing on Indigenous worldview and ontology and how we understand our relationship to the world? So there's a lot to say about this, but I only have 20 minutes and happy to chat more about this in the Q&A, is that we look at the natural world as being our teachers and relatives. So, you know, others, you know, if you look at definitions in Environmental Assessment Act, or I guess it's called Impact Assessment Act now, or CEPA, Canadian Environmental Protection, they define environment very specifically. It doesn't think about the natural world as actually being teachers and relatives, because we learn from them, and we had methods for doing that and continue to do so. So we consider, as well as people, elders, grandmothers, grandfathers, in our communities as people that we learn from, but the land itself is also our teachers and relatives, and they too can be impacted by environmental degradation, just like people are, on their own terms, and having their own agency. So the natural world, for example, water, also collects knowledge. So it has its own agency. So we can draw on this knowledge. So whatever trauma and injustice people are experiencing, when I'm in my community looking at the water, I know that also my ancestors did. It connects me to that there's also knowledge within the land and waters itself. So we have this expanded worldview of humanity and our place within it. It goes beyond the human dimension. That's probably, if I were to say there were a characteristic, very hard to do that because of the great diversity of Indigenous nations in Canada and around the world, is that we go beyond the human dimension and understanding our place in the world with the natural world. And also what we consider to be real and who has agency in that. And that has, implications for justice and who experiences it and how it can be achieved. And, how do we think about that, and how do we frame questions around that in terms of Indigenous environmental justice when the frame is coming from an Indigenous worldview and ontology. So Indigenous knowledge systems. So this is just an image of my family. We have the sugar bush. And so one of the things that I want to say about Indigenous knowledge systems is it isn't just knowledge to be extracted from communities and put into other processes. Sadly, that's kind of how a lot of people go about this, particularly in governments for environmental assessments, recovery plans for species at risk, because they fundamentally don't recognize that Indigenous peoples as societies, as I started off with this presentation, we had our own knowledge systems to support the goals of our society. And for the Anishinaabeg, that's to support life, support the continuance of life. So that's what our knowledge, and because all of us here likely as part of this webinar are all part of the Western sort of Canadian academic system. So we have who our own experts are, how do we decide what valid knowledge is, we have methods for deciding that. We have all these processes in place, who's going to get funded, what programs get funded, what needs to be changed, because we're part of, this society of education, like education is part of this society. So do the Indigenous people. So they had their own knowledge systems that supported the society for law, for governance, for education, for history, for health, whatever. So in extracting knowledge from communities to stick it into these other processes, other societies' processes, is a very extractive process and doesn't recognize that Indigenous knowledge systems are part of systems of Indigenous people. So if you want to access Indigenous knowledge, you actually have to work with people. Often I see, well, let's protect Indigenous knowledge. It's not possible to do that unless you're actually going to protect people and their livelihood and their rights. Like you just can't extract knowledge, stick it in a database and call it a day. That's not good enough. Indigenous legal traditions. So here I'm drawing on Professor Burrows at UVic, MA Craft at the University of Ottawa. Because I have this, as I encounter all these disaster reports all the time, and I know that this broader system is failing, Indigenous peoples, others, as Dr. Waldron pointed out, that so what other kind of laws can make a difference? What laws, like again, that were here for thousands of years, can make a difference in how we can envision a different kind of world. And so some of the work I'm doing right now is trying to codify and document what sort of, particularly focusing on Anishinaabeg, because those are the communities I'm working with at the moment, can make a difference in terms of how does this guide the kind of decision that we want to make. And if there is going to be Indigenous leadership and governance, particularly in relation to climate change, what does it look like? What kind of needs to be in place to enable that? And a lot of our legal traditions come from the natural world. So I'm not going to read these, you can read them, but it's become an interest of mine to just not kind of rely on other people's laws, although I think they're important because they hold the state accountable. They're still not Indigenous laws. Mininaabeg. So this is what we strive for as Anishinaabeg people. And the main point I want to make here is that living this good life, this being well in the world, is not possible unless the natural world is well. It's not. And so So when we're thinking about how to address, you know, the big challenges we're facing environmentally or ecologically, we have to think about the well-being of the natural world. And this informs my idea of Indigenous environmental justice. It's not just about people, it extends beyond the human dimension into the natural world. What does justice look like for water? What does justice look like for, you know, maple trees and a sugar bush? What does justice look like for certain, for species of animals or for fish? Like what does that look like for them? Some of the work of Professor Kraft is also that a lot of these entities also have their own laws. So water has its own laws, and she's been able to articulate that in some of her work. So how do we respect their own laws as well? So our laws as people are interacting with laws of these other beings or entities in creation. So those are kind of the things I think about, like what does that look like? And how do I try to articulate this beyond, you know, an Anishinaabeg? I often call it logic. So environmental justice and colonialism. So this is again kind of one of the reasons why I'm really like, you're really committed to Indigenous knowledge systems, laws, and governance, is because one of the findings of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People, I'm old enough to remember when this report came out, is that its main finding was basically the Canadian colonial and then later Canadian policy in relation to Indigenous people has been wrong. Like when every time they try to solve the Indian problem or Indigenous problem, it's been inappropriate. Like we need to come up with our own solutions and hold folks accountable, and we need to work with people like Dr. Waldron to hold folks accountable. And so Indigenous peoples have been excluded and often on the outside looking in. We know that Indigenous peoples are already more vulnerable and at risk than Canadians in every area of well-being. There's a well-being index you can find on the ISC website, ISC, Indigenous Services Canada, how that compares to the Canadian population. So we already kind of know this. And then it gets exacerbated through these other injustices. So there's this inequity in terms of burdens and benefits. And because we're talking about Indigenous people, there's already embedded within that a race component, which was another like important findings that came out of Murdered Missing Indigenous Women's report as well. Like a lot of this is race-based and gender-based. We're not able to engage in our own solutions, and other people's solutions can cause harm. So that's something that I kind of occupy myself with when I'm in a lot of these spaces. I find myself in. I'm skeptical of often other folks' solutions. So I think Dr. Waldron did a good job of summarizing some of this environmental injustice. We're pretty good at studying that, not so good at justice. And Stefan's come up, so that means my time's running out. So let me just, I just wanted to point to this, not so easy to deal with. So this is Ariel DeRanger from Indigenous Climate Action. Very hard to deal with capitalism, colonialism, and extractivism in dealing with environmental justice. And this, I think I already talked about. I'm going to end with this. This is my 2-year-old niece into sugar bush last spring in March. And so because we want to also move away from that deficit-based approach in relation to Indigenous people and look at strength-based approach in terms of what are our own solutions? How can we draw on our knowledge and our own way of life to address the challenges that we face? So we ask ourselves a set of different questions when we're applying an Anishinaabeg logic. How will our actions and our work show love for future generations? We ask ourselves that. How will our work benefit future generations? And what kind of ancestor do we want to be? So with that, miigwech, obviously lots to share here and looking forward to the conversations afterward. And thank you for listening. And sorry if that was a bit of a brain dump, but hopefully there was some gems in there.
And thank you, miigwech, Deborah. I really appreciate that. And once again, sorry for butting in. I hate to be the person who has to be watching the time because we would all love to hear all three of you for as long as you're willing to speak with us. But I will now turn to our third speaker, Dr. Muna Dajani. And before I do that, let me just mention to people in the audience, feel free to put questions into the Q&A at any time. You don't have to wait until we start the Q&A. In fact, it's nice to have a little bit of a queue of questions when we get to the Q&A period. So Dr. Muna Dajani is a senior research associate at the Lancaster Environment Center in Lancaster University. She's joining us from the UK. Her research focuses on documenting the lived experience of agricultural communities in the context of settler colonialism in the occupied Syrian, Golan, and Palestine, paying close attention to farming and water practices developed by these communities to reclaim their water rights. At the Lancaster Environment Center, she is working on a project entitled Transformations to Groundwater Sustainability, T2GS. Everyone has an acronym, which explores promising grassroots initiatives of holistic groundwater governance, shedding light on traditional and intergenerational skills and knowledges. Welcome, Dr. Dajani, over to you.
Thank you, Stepan, and thank you everyone for these splendid talks. Deborah and Ingrid, really happy to be here. It's a privilege also to hear from you all and to be engaged. I'm not, I would have to say, I'm not a lawyer myself, but I'm really interested in environmental water law, and I hope my presentation will give you a glimpse about another case around the world that is experiencing very systematic environmental justice against indigenous populations. And I hope this will be a start of a nice and interesting discussion that we can have afterwards. Let me just put on my slides. All right. So basically, I really wanted to just introduce you quickly to how I conceptualized, the idea of water and environmental justice in Palestine. And basically starting from the premise of what is Palestine today? How do we actually think about it geographically? Do we think about it also conceptually as a case of an ongoing settler colonial project? And I'd like to think of it and kind of frame it always in my research as not really bound to geographical fragmentations that have characterized Palestine throughout decades, where today we speak of Palestine as only the West Bank and Gaza as occupied territories, and we forget that Palestine in its entity is still enduring a settler colonial project. So from that that's the starting point usually for me to kind of situate where I stand on that and my positionality as a Palestinian researcher. The second thing is I really agree definitely with Ingrid, Deborah about how we need to historicize environmental injustices. We need to understand what are the root causes and what actually brings us today to a situation of unequal distribution of harms and benefits when it comes to environmental resources. And here I'd like to think also of Palestine as a case that has been heavily dehistoricized and desocialized when it comes to understanding water and environment. We come to think about it in nation state metrics. We come to understand it as, Palestine as a nation state building project that is undergoing military occupation, but that is also aiming to become a state in itself. And I think that has a lot of complications legally on what we frame as an injustice. I tried to also in my research kind of focus on ethnographies of water history and to think about also them as not in a romanticized manner, as also Deborah was speaking about, how do we actually bring them back to life in a way that helps us actually endure and overcome, the injustices we face today. So I also wanted to quickly share a few kind of readings and ideas that are shaping, my thinking about it. And thinking about, how multiple scholars have talked about how environmental justice framings how it has been kind of a hegemonic, more kind of Western idea of modernity, and the concepts cannot be transported to different contexts without running the risk of triggering new injustices. And I think also the speakers have referred to it directly and indirectly. So the fact that we also need to kind of frame our own, what does, as Deborah was saying, what does Indigenous environmental justice mean to us? And I think that's really an important question for Palestinians, for scholars studying Palestine to think about as well. And I kind of take that kind of decolonial approach as one that I feel very strongly with. Can you still see my screen? Okay. Another very interesting conceptualization of environmental justice is coming also from the idea that thinking, oh, well, if we think about climate change, it's just an intensification of environmental change that has been imposed on Indigenous people by colonialism. And this Kyle White and other Indigenous scholars speak about that very explicitly. And I also think that this resonates very well with the case in Palestine. Can we think about a human-induced climate change? When do we actually start speaking about the Anthropocene and anthropogenic climate change? And especially that we also never speak about kind of the indigenous experience of abrupt environmental change that happened to them. This is the case in Palestine, as much as is the case for indigenous communities in North America. So in this quest for settler colonialism to erase history, lived experiences, social realities, and possibilities for a future of Indigenous people, this is where a confrontation needs to happen, where Indigenous environmental justice could play a significant role. In Palestine, you know, there's multiple examples and cases and experiences of Palestinians who live in different different geographical jurisdictions that face environmental injustice, whether it's very explicit, where it's like a cutting off of centuries-old olive trees by Israeli settlers during the olive harvest, which is definitely not only an environmental catastrophe, but it's also a kind of weakening, you know, the momentum of people to stay on the land, their perseverance and their steadfastness. So it actually not only is physical, but it's very symbolic and very emotional to Palestinians when you see burning of these olive trees that have been there for generations, that you've been tending with love and care and traditional knowledge. That's one example, but there are many, many examples of you know, the manifestation of this environmental justice. And now Palestinian scholars and others are speaking about, you know, how do we need to kind of speak about the Anthropocene as fundamentally intertwined with colonial dispossession and its remaking of our lives, of our histories, of our futures. And this is really, I think, also very significant for the research that we do. So when I think of environmental and water injustice, I also kind of, you know, in my aim to historicize it, I aim to think about the transformations that have happened to the way we perceive these resources, to the relationships that have changed abruptly because of colonial legacy of dispossession and water dispossession, and the idea that nature is to be tamed for it to be productive, for it to be beneficial, that kind of not only stayed within these colonial regimes in Palestine, the British colonial regime, but it was metamorphosed into the settler colonial Zionist regime. And then after that, this type of model and worldview was also replicated within nation states that were established in our region. And now with the case of the Palestinian Authority, you know, aiming to become a country. So basically what I wanted to say here is that this colonial legacy continues, it's structural, and it continues to shape realities. And just wanted to show you one map as well, but it also relates to a lot of my research that I'm interested in, which is kind of looking at infrastructures where, you know, environments are shaped for the detriment of indigenous populations, whether they are Palestinians or Assyrians, like in Syrian occupied territories. But also I think of law as infrastructure, like Katie Meehan speaks about that in her research on water governance in Mexico. But I think of in Palestine how much, our laws have been shaped by foreign actors, and they have been undermining and dismissing any customary water laws, any indigenous understanding of water and environment. And kind of this developed into this very complicated reality that we live in today, where we kind of seek reparation, we seek justice through mechanisms such as international water law and others that don't really get us very far. So it's just to say that this has been a very complicated legacy that stays. So again, if we think about what type of environmental injustice are faced in Palestine, when we think about how much effort and investment and interest has been put about understanding what happens in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, we see that it's a case of catastrophic environmental injustices, whether in terms of water access and denying water access to Palestinians, while realities are completely different for Israeli Jewish settlers that live in occupied Palestinian territories or elsewhere in historic Palestine. We see how conditions such as the siege that's been ongoing for decades on the Gaza Strip has also caused environmental catastrophes and the sewage infiltration into groundwater, making water less. Now it says 95%, but it's now 97% of water unsuitable, unfit for human consumption. This is, again, not an environmental catastrophe caused by just natural reasons, but it's a very much man-made, it's a part of a settler colonial legacy that's been inflicted on Palestinians, on their land and on their resources. So all of these are kind of compounded together, or this actually shows a reality that this kind of a very complex but a very structural type of environmental justice that is not coincidental, that is not by chance, that is not due to practices, but is very much structural. But also in my research, I try to kind of think about that type of structural injustice as not confined to these geographical locations, as I mentioned before, actually goes beyond that. For instance, I look at cases where Palestinians who live inside Israel, who have Israeli citizenship, so we can consider them under the law to be equal, are not really equal. And it has historical, realities of why did that happen, the deprivation of access to land. Palestinians after 1948 were deprived almost entirely of their land, leaving them with less than not 5% of land belonging still to Palestinians who remained inside Israel, for instance. So they have no access to land, no access to water, and they're really governed by a system of differentiation where, again, agricultural development, water extraction, and control is in the hands of a certain group of people, and it's depriving others of the right to access water, the right to be present on the land in the way that is suitable for the traditions, for the traditional knowledge of these communities. So what I really wanted to emphasize here is that law can be tricky. If we speak of occupied territories and only frame environmental injustice happening there, then we're really not giving enough attention to injustices happening in what is termed today as proper Israel. Again, lots of interest and studies have been done on this that are really commendable, and I encourage everyone who's interested to also have a look at them. One study that has been done by Al-Haq, which is one of the most prominent human rights organizations in Palestine, that spoke about environmental injustice. And I really wanted to emphasize here something that they've mentioned in their conclusion of their study, but throughout their study, they highlighted cases where we can see environmental justice. One of the most famous, let's say, ones that always come up is the Gishuri Plants. So these are cases where Israel actually moved a lot of its plants, waste treatment and processing plants, fertilizer and pesticide plants inside Palestinian territories that have caused not only havoc and wreaked havoc for the environment, but has effect on health, well-being, and has spread lots of diseases across the communities that live around those factories. We have a lot of wastewater treatment plants and waste facilitations, waste treatment facilities also that Israel uses to dump its own waste into the West Bank. So the West Bank has been termed, a garbage dump for Israel. But this has also, again, this does not only relate to only occupied territories. Similar incidents of environmental injustice and environmental violations happen also within Israeli territory, especially close to Palestinian Bedouin communities, for example, or close to communities that are deemed to be unrecognized by the state, therefore, justifying for the state to carry out its acts of dumping waste in those areas. One important thing is that we need to understand how framings really play a role. In Al-Haq report, it speaks about how Palestinian people are victims of a serious and systematic environmental justice arising from this vacuum built into the Oslo Accords. And the Oslo Accords are these processes that have been put in place in the 90s for Palestinians to have their own state, which never really materialized. But the fact that, these, institutional arrangements, let's call them, and state building arrangements are actually to the detrimental effect of Palestinians, their health and the health of their environment. So these are only glimpses, and I'm sorry if I'm rushing into it, but showing you example of how, this is beyond the scale of just occupied territories and environmental injustice is happening there. Today, there is a great movement that's happening around, Palestine being framed not only as a justice issue, but it's a climate justice issues. And I think this opens wider doors into thinking about beyond, these confined geographies, into thinking about, wider issues of environmental justice and climate justice, and to go beyond framing Palestine as a state building project that is suffering from specific injustices happening in it. Another thing is to kind of look at, and this is something I'm interested in pursuing even more and more, but many great researchers have looked into, this idea where the state, also the settler colonial state, becomes kind of the beacon and or the guardian of environmental development and green energy development, or where it kind of instills laws and regulations regarding picking wild herbs, which happens inside Israel, where Israel doesn't allow Palestinians to go in season into the mountains to pick up zatar, which is thyme, and the akub, which is another very famous shrub that grows in Palestinian hills and mountains that people know how to pick and know when to go. The traditional knowledge is still there and is still strong, and people want to connect to the land. But laws and regulations come in to kind of curb that connection with the land. And there's great research on that. And another thing is also when we think about, green energy and green colonialism happening in areas like the occupied Golan Heights, where under the guise of, committing to mitigate climate change and to reduce emission, Israel is actually developing wind energy projects and turbines in occupied territories in the occupied Syrian Golan, and how people are protesting this, not only because they protest development or they protest the idea of building a wind energy project, but they see it as a further uprooting of their presence on the land. So I think this is really kind of where we see engagement from a grassroots perspective with environmental justice issues, and linking them not only to the kind of the distributions of harms caused by states or government or officials instilling factories into their lands to process waste or all of that, but kind of taking it a deeper level into looking at kind of issues of existential issues of their well-being and the well-being of their community and their presence on the land. So I just wanted to end there, but kind of thinking about, there is a lot of very depressing kind of facts on the ground that are taking place every day for Palestinians in terms of their uprooting from their land, dispossession of their resources, injustices that take the form of very different, take very different forms, including environmental and water injustices. But I see also the potential and the rise of, lots of grassroots initiatives and communities building on traditional knowledge again. So I see that as a potential to conceptualize, Palestine as an environmental and climate justice case. And I hope that, this discussion and hopefully future ones will enlighten me more to learn from the very rich Indigenous experience as well. So wanted to thank you and stop there. And I hope I'm within the time limit.
Thank you so much. Indeed, you are. I really appreciate your remarks, Dr. Dajani, and thank you for that very eye-opening introduction to those issues in Palestine. Those are our three presentations, and we have something like 15 minutes time left for questions. There is a question ready, and I would just ask the audience to please feel free to type in more questions into the Q&A, and I will moderate, and I'm going to take the first question. Well, it's right now the only question, but I know how these things work. I'm sure there will be more questions. And the question is directed at Deborah McGregor, and it says, currently as an Indigenous person, I'm forced to work within current legal and land tenure systems to protect lands, including conservation areas and parks, until UNDRIP is implemented, UNDRIP being the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. How do you recommend that we find our own solutions?
First, let me ask if you can hear me, because literally, for some bizarre reason, right outside my door, there's construction. Can you still hear me, or are you hearing this horrible noise that I'm hearing? Okay, good.
Hearing you.
Just want to make sure. So that's a great question. And I think the way that Indigenous peoples kind of approached land, like it kind of, the vocabulary kind of changed over time, right? Before it used to be protesters and land defense, land protectors. Prior to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, it was just to, I think it was always multiple strategies employed. It wasn't just like one approach to be able to engage with it. So sometimes you do have to work within the existing frameworks that exist and then try to change that. But when Canada didn't sign on to UNDRIP, Indigenous nations still asserted it. They didn't say, oh, Canada didn't sign on to this and doesn't approve of it when it was first passed in 2007. They continued to assert it, and very specific articles within it. But I think another way to sort of approach the question, just because I happen to be working on a project called Conservation as Reconciliation. And actually there's some of the case studies, or one of the leads for this is Eli Entz. I think he's from Vancouver Island, I think so, rather than the mainland. And that whole project is what does Indigenous-led conservation look like? Like, what does that actually look like, as opposed to again being sort of rhetoric? That's kind of all the rage right now. Is like, what does that look like? And And part of the research, part of the work for that, and a lot of it is very applied and practice-based, is looking at Indigenous knowledge systems, Indigenous legal systems. What does Indigenous governance look like? So you're not just, again, being plopped into other people's systems and hoping for the best. I mean, it is better, because, you know, when I worked for Environment Canada, I did have to review all these EAs, and they were better when Indigenous, you know, traditional knowledge was there, but they weren't, but it wasn't, but the outcome would be an outcome that Indigenous nations didn't even want, right? So, so even though it was there, it was better, but it still didn't result in what people would have liked to have seen. So to me, looking to Indigenous-led kind of solutions, whatever they might mean, you have to look to community, I think, for that, like, because they'll draw on their own, again, getting away from this sort of deficit sort of model into what are the strengths that already exist in the community? How can this come from the ground up, then inform these other processes? So I don't know if that exactly answers your questions, but in reading it, when I looked at it before the Q&A section started, those what came to my mind is that Indigenous peoples, you know, are pretty good at trying to hold folks accountable. They'll just say it. And when you're not part of the system, like when you're not part of being able to make decisions, being part of those processes, or you're alienated, not listened to, Indigenous peoples are pretty good at using other avenues like advocacy to be able to be heard when they're not being heard in very specific processes. So hopefully that's helped. Maybe what I'll do in the Q&A or the chat, I'm not sure if participants can see the chat, is just give you a link to that website that looks at what does Indigenous-led kind of look like for conservation. So I'll look for that and include it in there in case you're further interested in it. Thank you for the question.
Yes, Deborah, if you just select everyone when you're typing your message in the chat, it will go to attendees and panelists. Thank you for that answer. I'll go to the next question, and thank you folks for putting some questions into the Q&A. We've got a good supply now. The next question is from Brenna Bandar, and by the way, I would say questioners' names, but the previous one was from anonymous attendee, so I couldn't say who it was from. And Brenna writes, thank you so much for the brilliant presentations. It was really enlightening to have these different contexts brought together. Can you comment on concrete actions that we can consider taking now in this moment of climate crisis in relation to our local and global contexts as lawyers, academics, and law students? Many thanks for any reflections you might offer. So that is directed at all three. I would invite whoever to step up to the plate to start us off in an answer.
When people ask what are some concrete steps, whether it be climate change or climate justice and environmental justice, I always think about three main issues. One to me is about education, and that's structural. It's longer term. The other is, I think, legislation, and the other is community mobilizing. So with respect to environmental change and justice, I think there's an absence of discussions on climate justice or climate change and how it impacts communities and environmental racism in high schools and maybe to some extent at universities. And I always say that, you know, the 14-year-old right now is our future leader. They're going to be in positions of power, and we need to provide them with the right analytical framework in order to understand these issues so that when time comes for them to make decisions, they're making, I'm not going to say the right decision or what I think or my decision, what I think is right, but they're making considered decisions. And not just putting a landfill in a community or a pipeline, that before they've done that, they've considered these issues. So I think the school system has a part to play in introducing these topics with a justice lens, but more broadly talking about structural inequities. These are simply other forms of structural inequities, right? It's another form of racism, environmental racism. Climate change is another form of inequity. So we need to start this maybe even earlier than high school, certainly earlier than middle school. We need to start to talk about these issues, because once again, the very passionate young people that we see today who are driving the climate change movements are the future leaders. And if we can provide them with the right conceptualizations, analytical framework, they will make decisions that are different from the leaders that we have today. I also think that we need legislation. I talked about environmental racism legislation, but we need climate justice legislation that's similar to environmental racism, centers the experiences of Indigenous and other impacted communities in that legislation, talking about the social, political, economic issues that these communities are facing and how climate injustices are manifested out of those inequities, those long-standing structural inequities, historical legacy, colonialism, all these things. It has to be placed in the context so people have a good understanding of how environmental racism is enabled by those structural inequities. But I also think that community mobilizing is important. You know, that brings attention to the issue. When I think of Sabaganagadie First Nation and Pictou First Nation, it's been years, decades, and some, it shouldn't take that long, no, but it's been decades of mobilizing, grassroots mobilizing, being an agitator that resulted in the success that we've seen over the past 2 years, the cancellation of Alton Gas and the closure of the pulp mill. So those three things: education, which is going to be about structural changes in the school system, so we have leaders that are truly prepared. Grassroots mobilizing brings attention to the issue, but it has to be sustained. And the way you sustain it is you need to find a cheerleader, obviously in government. And third, legislation, climate justice legislation that centers the experiences of Indigenous, Black, Brown communities around the world.
Would you like to add anything, Dr. Dajani?
Yeah, thank you, Stepan. And just, echoing, what Ingrid was saying, I think that's very powerful. And in the case, especially of Palestine, which is in a very difficult situation, because not only is it, controlled by a settler colonial regime, but it's also influenced by donor community and the global kind of control of over what climate change is, what environmental legislation should look like, and all of that is very kind of limiting to reaching any justice, whether climate justice, environmental justice, or political justice. So I think one thing is important, and I will echo what Ingrid's saying about education, is that how do we actually center Indigenous knowledge at the heart of Palestinian justice movement, and thinking about climate change, not just to replicate, existing models that are based on different conceptualization of what has caused climate change and what do we need to do about it, and how do we actually build our own understanding of it. Because for Palestinians, when we speak about environment or climate justice, we are actually speaking about issues that are not considered top priority because of settler colonial regimes. So how do we actually make the linkages even clearer to communities about how interlinked everything, all of these issues are? And I think this will need a lot of mobilization on the ground. That is already happening and is taking shape, but it requires kind of the support, as Brenna mentioned, of people who are working in different scholarship, whether law or geography, critical geography, and law, and other fields.
Let me then go on to the next question. I'm going to take a question from Leora Lazarus and actually make it in a little bit more generic terms. So in October, the United Nations Human Rights Council adopted a resolution recognizing the human right to a healthy environment. Leora asks what your thoughts are on that, panelists, but I would ask just more broadly, what are your thoughts on the role of legally recognized human right to a healthy environment in addressing some of the challenges that you've been speaking about?
Well, Canada does not have a legal right to a healthy environment, right? Many countries around the world, they have that legal right, and we've been fighting for that right for a long time, and that is what CEPA is about, the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. So that's a bit strange, because Canada is considered a leader on human rights, but we don't have the right to a healthy environment. I support CEPA, and it dovetails quite nicely with the environmental racism legislation. My only concern with CEPA, and if I were to strengthen it, is that, yes, Canadians have a right to a healthy environment, but CEPA needs to center the experiences of Indigenous and other affected communities more. And so you've got these two bills, environmental racism bill, and you've got CEPA, and some people would say, well, you know, why don't you make the environmental racism bill part of SEPA? And I say, nope, I still want it to be independent because I don't think SEPA has done a good enough job of centering the experiences of Indigenous and other impacted communities. So when we talk about Canadians have the right to a healthy environment, we have to also say, but some communities, like Indigenous communities, seem to have less of a right, right? We need to continue to put that spotlight on the communities that are disproportionately burdened. And for me, SEPA and our understanding of the right to a healthy environment must highlight those communities that seem to have less of a right. So that's my spiel on that.
Oh, just to build upon what Dr. Waldron talked about is, I think a lot of legal scholars have been trying to argue different ways that legislation can provide people with that right. But in one of the areas that I work in is water justice, and the UN also passed a resolution about people's right to safe water, and look at the situation still existing in Canada in relation to the water crisis and First Nations. But what it does do is it helps communities and people who are disadvantaged or vulnerable in whatever way to advance it, because Canada has to go account for this, and they have to, and you know, they can be thoroughly embarrassed internationally by not providing this to people. So like they have with water, David Suzuki Foundation, Human Rights Watch, they've done reports and just said Canada hasn't done this. So these enable some kind of accountability. It enables a kind of conversation that doesn't happen. Like people can say, look, like the human right to water isn't existing here. And it can kind of push that a little bit. It gives people just something else, another tool to kind of work with. So it's a good thing, but at the same time, you know, the Human Right to Water resolution was 2010, and then Human Rights Council a year later, and still we've got, you know, 10 years later, a lot of these challenges. But it does, you know, but it put it in the radar, so it can do that. But then you need the people to decide, well, what does that actually look like? Because they do have their limitations, but they give people a tool. They give people something to work with, and hopefully kind of hold nation states and Canada accountable by saying, okay, well, how are we going to deal with this? What does our legislation look like? And maybe it'll give more weight to, you know, to Bill C-230, because it can help deal with that, right? So yeah, so those are my thoughts on that. Like people will use it, and they'll bring it to attention. It'll be in the radar. People will talk about it, as opposed to, you know, it being within maybe the realm of environmental law in legal scholarship, and it not really getting out there where it needs to be as part of everyday conversations with people. So thank you for the question.
Well, shall I was just going to make a clarification. Dr. Waldron was talking about SEPA. For those who aren't familiar with the acronym, that would be the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, the sort of the main federal environmental protection statute. We have only a couple of minutes left. Let me pose one other question next in queue, which is about what you think about the claim that some folks make that certain careers in resource extraction industries are not in the best interests of Indigenous peoples, and thinking about a First Nations single mom seeking work in the oil and gas industries. The question is posed specifically in terms of Indigenous people, First Nations, but I guess the more general question is how do you think that people who are members of communities facing environmental injustice ought to deal with the dilemma of livelihoods, when sometimes the livelihoods that are available are in the very industries that are destroying the environment? And sorry for not directing that at anyone in particular. That's an open.
Yeah, I wasn't sure, because I didn't see your mute. Were you going to say something?
No.
Oh, okay. I'll maybe try to take a shot at that. It's really complicated, and I think looking at it in a non-binary way is really critical. Because the fact of the matter is that when basic human rights aren't being met, then this is when, you know, engagement perhaps in Indigenous communities are also very diverse, even internally. So there's always different kind of views, and people like me who work in communities are always trying to negotiate this and try to figure out, you know, what is it that, you know, that the community wants, and I'm not going to decide what's best for them. I let go of that a long time ago. So they'll decide that and let me know, and I'll give advice and views when asked. And so it's complicated, and it's an interesting tension. But I guess there's a couple ways of looking at it. Communities' human rights aren't being met, so then these become, you know, ways maybe to come out of the situation. Ontario anyway, and also Canada, like they always sort of link this with prosperity. Of course, Indigenous people should have prosperity. We're trying to close the gap, but it's kind of their version about what that is, as opposed to the Indigenous version about what that is, which isn't really, I don't think, been really seriously entertained. So there's that other kind of tension. The other one is those are the and maybe I'm saying this because I worked for Environment Canada for 10 years until I hit what I call hit the wall. Those are the very industries that need to change. And they're the very industries that maybe need to have Indigenous peoples externally saying, hey, what are you doing? And do all the things that they need to do that, have the kind of legislation that Dr. Ingrid's talking about that put pressure in a different way. But maybe there also needs to be pressure also internally to say, hey, you need to change the way you're doing things, because this isn't, you know, that's kind of what I found myself saying 90% of the time. And I did see changes. Like I did see Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement now has traditional knowledge recognition. And so that advocacy kind of made a difference. I just think there needs to be multiple strategies to try to change, and well, not only change, but transform, like not tweak, but transform what's going on, so we can look forward to a future. And I was going to write in the chat to look at the work of Angel Aluk at York. This is a very question she looks at as part of work, and it's Treaty 8. She's in the tar sands territory, so I'm just going to put that in the link to look at her work, and that's what her whole PhD was on. Nowhere doing justice to what she talked about. So great question. I'll put it in there, or maybe I'll do chat to all in case other people want to look at it as Stepan. And sorry we went past. That took me a long time to answer, so apologies for that, but a great question.
I do appreciate that. I think we do need to draw things to a close now. We are a little bit over time. Unfortunately, we are leaving some fascinating questions about visual and creative arts, the concept of deaths of despair, and the question of access to justice unanswered. Thank you for posing those questions, and I'm sorry we weren't able to get to them. I would just like to thank our speakers for giving of their time and knowledge today. Thank the audience for staying with us, and thank the co-sponsoring organizations, the Indigenous Legal Studies, the Center for Business Law, and the Center for Law and the Environment at Allard School of Law. And I hope to see, see is a bit of a misnomer, but I hope that many of you will join us in our future events in the Anti-Racism and the Law Initiative. So with that, I will say goodbye and thank you very much to everybody. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone. Have a good evening or afternoon, wherever you are.